This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream and Nebula. Gender and sex have been at the center of public discourse for a few decades now, and by the public, I mean gay people, and by discourse, I mean arguing. If you, like me, were unlucky enough to be assigned online at birth, you've probably heard the mantra repeated that gender and sex are different, that sex is your body and gender is your brain, or sex is your body and gender is the way you interact with the world. The catchphrase comes from a good place. It's an easy way to explain why gender identity matters and why we should respect trans people. But honestly, I'm kind of over it. This take has been a fixture of the queer discourse for over a decade now, and I'm not gonna lie, it's getting kind of stale. Like, okay, sure, they're different.
So,
No, I'm saying
what now?
Nowadays, distinguishing between gender and sex feels so tame, it's basically useless. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, for most of history, the distinction between gender and sex didn't exist at all. Gender roles were so tied to birth assignment that we didn't even have a word for them. Women were kept from power because of their delicate constitution. The social aspect of gender, what it meant to live as a man or a woman, was explained away by biology. It all came down to sex. In the English-speaking world, it wasn't until the 20th century that men and women's places in society really came into question. The first wave of feminism had come and gone, and it was mostly a success for white women. But after they won their battles and a handful of legal rights were gained for white women, it became clear just how much more needed to change before we could be equal. People began recognizing patriarchy as more than just the natural state of things. It was a system upheld in a million little ways, and it was one they could try to dismantle. Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, really kicked this off in 1949, talking about how gender isn't innate, it's drilled into us from childhood. She calls out the church, the institution of marriage, and the state of modern motherhood, saying all are obstacles to equality. Later, in 1955, the sexologist John Money coined the term gender role while on a break from scarring children for life. Fuck this guy. With the groundwork laid, we were off to the races. Gender roles were a major focus of second-wave feminism, and they've been in the spotlight ever since. Sure, the concept feels stale now, but in the 40s and 50s, talking about gender roles as separate from biology, as something we made up, was pretty radical. Acknowledging gender as separate from sex means that things don't have to be this way. Your birth sex doesn't have to define the rest of your life. We recognize gender so we can criticize it. This is where the so-called anti-gender movement comes in. A growing faction of the Catholic right, especially in Eastern Europe and South America, have been fighting against gender as a concept. They oppose it for the reasons you'd expect. It goes against God's will, it threatens the traditional family, and so on. The Christian right is deeply invested in women's place in society, so of course they don't want us to challenge it. But it's not just those reactionaries that want us to stop talking about gender. It's also these reactionaries that want us to stop talking about gender. What a bait and switch that was. I guess it was in the title, actually. Trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs, are an increasingly mainstream contingent of feminists. And they say talking about gender is a waste of time because it doesn't matter. They prefer to talk only about sex, which they say is simple, unchangeable, and the only real factor in sexism. Since gender is out of touch with reality, biology is king. I know that to many in the trans community, this line of thinking is distressing. If what they say is true, then trans people have no hope of being accepted as our true gender. All of us are doomed to be defined by our birth sexes forever. But is it possible TERFs have a point? No. No, not at all. Today, I'm here to examine what TERFs believe about sex, what they believe about gender, and why they're bafflingly wrong about both. Buckle up, baby. TERFs put a lot of stock in sex. The biological kind, not the kind their husbands keep DMing me about. They argue that biological sex is the root of all misogyny, from systemic discrimination to casual sexism. They say it's the determining factor in how we mature, how we're raised, how we're targeted and treated, and that the genders we live in have little to no bearing on any of these. This belief in sex above all sets them apart from most modern feminists. It's ostensibly what makes them radical, because the world is trending towards gender gender neutrality in a big way. The shift is most obvious when we're talking about bodies. You might hear people who menstruate instead of women, or birthing parent instead of mother. I think this change in our language is unequivocally a good thing. It invites more people to the table. It lets everyone with a stake in this stuff know they're welcome in the conversation. It's also just more accurate. The old language left out cis women who don't get periods and cis mothers who didn't give birth to their kids. Unsurprisingly, the shift in how we talk about bodies has sparked some major backlash from the anti-gender crowd. They often say it's inappropriate or objectifying to talk about bodies in this way. Take it from someone who definitely knows things about women's bodies.
How about the assertion that men and women are essentially social constructs? Even biology is a social construct. This is the most extreme form of the argument, that there are men with uteruses and women with vaginas.
There are women with vaginas? I had no idea. Hot take, Ben.
CNN the other day headlined that individuals with a cervix should make sure that they are cervically screened for cervical cancer. I have no idea what an individual with a cervix is.
We know, buddy. We know. Anyway, they seem concerned that gender-neutral language excludes more people than it includes. Like if we describe the struggles faced by people with uteruses, we're no longer talking about women with uteruses. I'm gonna say something really brave here, but I think women are people. Thank you. TERFs seem especially concerned that we'll abstract words like man and woman into meaninglessness. They argue that if we approach biology in a gender-neutral way, we won't be able to talk about sexism or discrimination anymore. As it's often put, how can we talk about misogyny if we don't know what a woman is? And of course, what a woman is to them begins and ends with sex. So clarifying the meaning of sex, again, not the kind their husbands keep DMing me about, has been a major priority. Janice Raymond's book, The Transsexual Empire from 1979, addresses this question right at the start. It's a foundational text of anti-trans feminism and has been hugely influential in the movement. That said, Janice Raymond defines sex in a pretty sensible way. She used a pre-existing definition of sex that was outlined by the gender role creep himself, John Money. She has some criticisms of his definition, but mostly goes with it anyway. Money defines sex based on 6 criteria: chromosomal, anatomical/morphological, genital, legal, endocrine/hormonal, and psychological, which Raymond calls psychosocial. The idea is that the archetypal woman has 2 X chromosomes, feminine fat distribution, and bone structure. This has nothing to do with eugenics, I swear. Ovaries, a female sex marker on her birth certificate, lots of estrogen in her system, and the behaviors and attitudes that women are conditioned to have. And sure, I mean, obviously people who tick all of these boxes are widely thought of as biologically female. Endosex cis women's womanhood is really not under question here. So the only thing these rigid definitions can do is help us decide who isn't a real woman. They can only suggest who we should exclude from our feminism, not who we should include. And why should exclusion be the starting point? The genderqueer activist Riki Wilchins called this out in 1997 in their book Read My Lips. The language has evolved since this book came out, but it's still a really good read.
Even momentarily putting aside the issue of intersexual women, doesn't reliance on equipment return us to a definition of women in which biology becomes destiny? Doesn't it return us to the classic oppressive construction of women which defines her strictly by reproductive organs and function? Will we replace consciousness raising with crotch checks, complete with the edifying spectacle of us all squatting and pointedly inspecting each other's genitals as if we were a group of chimpanzees? Worst of all, we started out to liberate women. We wanted to represent their political interests and in so doing open up whole new horizons for them. Yet our first act is to fence off the things that they cannot do and still be considered women. Our message is no longer, you are free to become whatever your talent and heart allow, but rather, you are free to become whatever your talent and heart allow, as long as it's not too masculine or too much like men, as long as you continue to look and act like a woman. And it appears that the woman you will look and act like is based on that traditional, limiting, heterosexual-based model that we hope to chuck for good.
And really, what does this rigidity even serve? We know we can talk about biology and things that are usually considered women's issues without falling prey to bioessentialism. We do it all the time. In fact, TERFs' arguments that we can't even talk about biology anymore usually come up when queer people are talking about biology, just in a gender-neutral way. Conversations about chest feeding instead of breastfeeding, or cancer screenings for people with prostates instead of men, are usually what rile them up in the first place. But we need to have these conversations because, of course, trans people know that sex matters. We know this because all people have sexed traits that impact our lives. For a trans woman, this could look like having broad shoulders or having breasts, or the unique way people treat you when you have both. We aren't ignorant of biology at all. In fact, I think trans people have a really valuable, really unique point of view on sex and the many things it entails. For instance, I have some traits that aren't considered female, like I can't get pregnant, and I have a good sense of when they matter and when they don't. It matters when I'm talking to my doctor, and when governments pass draconian abortion bans. It doesn't matter in my daily life as a lesbian partner to someone who couldn't get me pregnant anyway. It doesn't confer privilege in a job interview or when I'm walking alone late at night. I wish people trusted that trans people know what our lives are like and how our bodies impact our struggles. I mean, how a lot of us have changed the traits you use to determine a person's sex and seen it change the way we're treated. Medical transition is an expensive, years-long process, and we don't do it for no reason. If we thought sex was irrelevant, why would so many of us change our own? The transsexual empire came out over 40 years ago, and it doesn't perfectly reflect what modern transphobes have to say about sex. I read a fair bit of it while researching this video, and I was shocked to see how measured it is in a lot of ways, at least compared to the hateful stuff coming out right now. Don't get me wrong, it's a deeply hateful book, but at the same time, one of the criteria it used to define sex was psychosocial, the way you feel about your sex and your place in the world. And that's just gender? The transsexual empire was gender critical, but it did acknowledge gender as real and at least occasionally relevant. You'd never see that now. Today's TERFs are rabidly anti-gender. They've made it clear that gender has no place at all in their analysis. For modern TERFs, sex is simple, immutable, and objective, where gender is just the opposite. It's imaginary, it's immaterial, it's far too slippery to be of any use. Most contemporary TERF writing posits that genders are nothing but harmful stereotypes, and that by living in our preferred genders, trans people perpetuate these stereotypes. They're especially quick to come for the girls over this. Oh, you think being a woman is just about being beautiful and feminine. It's like they don't even see us. You think if I thought that I would look like this right now? They argue that trans women are all hyper feminine and shallow, and that we perpetuate the idea that you need to be those things to count as a woman. Claiming a gender at all is seen as misogynist violence. However, they don't really apply this idea evenly. While they'll often judge trans women for presenting as female, that judgment is rarely turned inwards. Cisgender transphobes, most of them at least, never seem to question their own gendering. Why do you have long hair? Why do you wear makeup? Because if my womanhood is oppressive, surely that is too. And Riki Wilchins actually confronted Janice Raymond on this point in person. Here's an excerpt of a speech they gave in 1994.
You say we want to pass as women. Well, I don't pass. I wear this transsexual menace logo every place I go. Between the two of us, only you pass as a woman. If, as de Beauvoir held, one is not born a woman but becomes one, if femininity is an invention of men foisted on women, if feminine behavior is a learned cultural performance of hair, clothing, voice, gesture, and stance, so one is perceived as a female, then by presenting yourself as a woman, it is you who have been co-opted into traditional sex roles, you who serve their institution, and you who are performing here.
Trans people are marked by our active choices about gender. Think of all those cliched images of trans girls coming into their own, spotted trying on their mom's clothes through a crack in the door, viewed through a vanity mirror, meticulously applying lipstick and false eyelashes. And obviously there's nothing wrong with doing these things. If any femtrans girls are watching this, My point is that even when we're accepted as women, the whole dolling up routine is seen as foreign to us. On the other hand, cis women applying makeup is part of the expected daily routine. In movies and TV, the effort that cis women put into their looks is utterly invisible. Women wake up with perfectly curled hair and a full face of makeup, and it's never even acknowledged. It's like this pristine femininity is so innate to their bodies that it happens all by itself. Of course, it doesn't. Being AFAB doesn't mean you wake up every morning wearing lip gloss and kitten heels. Cis women getting dolled up is just as much a feminization as it is for trans women. As a wise fracking tycoon once said, "We're all born naked and the rest is drag." What's that? You're on estrogen? No, you can't be on the show. When cis people take on the gendered behavior that's expected of them, it's assumed to be a natural outgrowth of their biology. You like dresses, not because you're a girl, but because you're female. And females are drawn to these things. It could be that, or you tease people in your class because you're male, and that's how males show affection. I can see how, for some cis women, gender and sex might feel like they are the same thing. All these gendered traits are understood as extensions of their sex. That's how you get people saying shit like, "I'm not cis, I'm normal," or "I don't have pronouns, I'm just a dude."
Hey there, what are your pronouns?
Oh, I'm cis. I don't have pronouns.
No pronouns? Damn, another victim of gender identity theft.
Some cis people get so offended when you point out that they too have a gender. But they do. Their behaviors and their choices don't exist in a vacuum. The belief that every part of a person's identity boils down to sex is sexist. And to be fair, it's not something all TERFs believe. Many say femininity is completely artificial. Some TERFs call for gender abolition on a wider scale. Going beyond gender roles, they want to do away with gender altogether. A prominent TERF we'll talk about another day, named Dansky, put it this way in her new book.
For feminists, gender is a purely social construction that is loaded with various patriarchal roles, values, and expectations. The reason feminists have been calling for the abolition of gender is that, from a feminist perspective, gender is a prison that keeps women in a position of subservience to men. For feminists, in other words, gender is the problem, not the solution.
This argument's a kind of funny one. She says trans people are part of the problem because we have gender identities, and gender is a social construct. The funny thing is, saying that gender is a social construct isn't a controversial take in most trans communities. Lots of us agree. I've argued against the innateness of gender in a few of my videos over the past year. I've argued against the importance of identity in general. I mean, I went viral for a take adjacent to this. I owe my whole career to saying gender is kind of silly sometimes. And having read like thousands of comments on my videos about gender, I can't remember that many people disagreeing with me, because I acknowledge that even if gender is fake, trans people are still here and we still matter. As it turns out, being critical of gender is actually pretty welcomed by a community that's marginalized because of their genders. For any TERFs watching, here's a quick tip on how to get the trans community to listen to you. Don't do hate speech. Frankly, if anyone knows gender is fake, it's us. We've seen this shit from the inside. We know just how inconsistent the rules are. It's like, I can see this shit in 6 dimensions, buddy. You have no idea just how made up it is. But something can be made up and still matter. Social construct doesn't mean unimportant. Money is a social construct. That doesn't mean you can go around burning $100 bills. Traffic laws are a social construct. You don't see us barreling through red lights about it. When we engage with these things, we kind of make them real. When Judith Butler says gender is performative, that's what they mean. I think. Honestly, I read one sentence of gender trouble and enter a fugue state, so who can say for sure? Gender is upheld by all of us and by so many systems. I can't just decide to stop being gendered. The world wouldn't listen. I guess we could all collectively opt out, start themming it up in every city on earth. In my last video, I made a joke that was insensitive to the non-binary community. I am so deeply sorry. I'll be taking a step back to learn and reflect. Thank you all. But I'm not convinced that would do much good. It wouldn't cancel out all our gendered experiences. I can't imagine patriarchy would vanish the second all our genders do. Not everyone feels this attachment to gender, of course. There are agender people out there living their best lives miles away from this stupid discourse, and I love it for them. But letting go of mine would feel like a genuine loss. Being a woman is important to me, and not just internally. When reflecting on how my gender has mattered, I think of all the gendered bonds I've formed with people, as a sister and a daughter and a friend. I think of the career opportunities that dried up the second I came out, the schooling that became impossible to finish. It wasn't because of my sex. All this happened before I changed anything about my body or my birth certificate. It was about my gender. I was a woman, and a trans one at that. It wouldn't do me much good to ignore that, would it? I think deep down, TERFs must know the genders we live in are relevant. It's so obvious that they must see it. They usually feign ignorance and insist that trans women never face misogyny because we're male, and that trans men remain inescapably female in every way that matters. But their tactics tell a different story. I mean, they really fight to keep trans people in the closet, right? They want books banned and spaces unsafed and clinics shut down. They want conversion therapy legalized, and God, I wish that was hyperbole, but they literally do. All this despite their insistence that nothing can change a person's sex, that this dangerous gender ideology can only change people's genders. Something doesn't add up here. If sex is all that matters and nothing can ever change it, who cares if people want to transition? Who cares if people want to change their gender? By their own logic, everyone from catcallers to lawmakers should see through the facade and treat us as our birth sex. If gender doesn't matter, someone changing theirs should make no difference. But that's bullshit, and they know it's bullshit. Just listen to how TERFs talk about transmasculine teenagers, even the ones who don't want hormones or surgery. They act so concerned that young girls are transitioning to escape misogyny and the challenges of girlhood, and they concede that it tends to work. They admit that people treat you differently based on your lived gender, sometimes better or worse, but often just differently. It's a quiet admission that the genders we live in are materially relevant, regardless of sex.
The transgender movement would have us believe that sex does not exist as a material reality and should be replaced by the utterly incoherent concept of gender identity. They are winning.
Their current line only works if trans people hold gender in high regard and think it's this thing that is persistently, deeply true. And some people think that, but I don't. The feelings and actions we describe as gender are real, and the things we use to decide sex, like hormones and chromosomes, are real too. I don't think the cultural meanings we prescribe them are real. I don't think a person's sex should matter. But as long as it does, it's worth talking about. Much to the chagrin of TERFs everywhere, I ultimately believe in sex. The question is, do they? Through my research, I kept returning to that definition of sex used in the transsexual empire, the one with 6 criteria to it. I know this has been a pretty dense video, so I'll refresh you on what the criteria were. Chromosomal, anatomical, genital, legal, hormonal, and psychosocial. Janice Raymond using this definition struck me as a real weak point in her reasoning, because despite her insistence that trans women will never be female, transitioning can change nearly all of these criteria. And I say women because that's who the book's about, but this applies to all trans people. Working up the list backwards. Psychosocial. We identify as women, and we could be said to have the attitudes and behaviors associated with women. Hormonal. We can easily change the dominant hormone in our bodies with HRT. Hi, baby. Hi. Legal. In many countries, we can change our legal sex. Genital. You can't change the gametes your body has, but you can get rid of them altogether. In fact, it's fun. I highly recommend it. Anatomical. We can change our bodies with hormones and surgery. The last one is the most fixed. There's no way to change the chromosomes in your cells, nor would it really be worthwhile if you could. More on this in a little bit. It's funny. In what's basically the founding text of anti-trans feminism, 5 of the 6 definitions of biological sex acknowledge trans women as not being male. The one that doesn't was discovered in 1882, and I'm pretty sure sex has been around longer than that. Janice Raymond's definition of sex lets trans people off pretty easy, no real gotchas to be found. To her credit, it was honest and scientific for the time, but starting your book about how trans women are men with several ways trans women are women is didactically pretty weak. It's also not nearly as catchy as it should be if you're trying to build a mass movement. You're telling me sex is these 6 things and some aren't binary and some are a social construct? How am I going to fit that on a t-shirt? Unsurprisingly, this multi-pronged approach has fallen by the wayside in recent years. In the 4 decades since the transsexual empire came out, the TERF line on what sex is has actually shifted quite a few times. Sometimes it changes meaning more than once in a single conversation. To start, they might say, sex is what's on your birth certificate, a simple binary data point, easy to understand, impossible to change. That is, until you do change it. From there, it might move to sex is what's in your pants. Of course, you can change that too. In that case, saying sex is really just your chromosomes should do the trick. In the past year, I've noticed them shifting towards the position that sex is only your gametes, whether you produce sperm cells or egg cells. I think they'll settle on this one for a while, though the others still pop up sometimes. For a supposedly objective thing, transphobes' definition of sex is real slippery, and if it's so fundamental to their movement, you think they would have agreed on it beforehand. According to TERFs, we should talk about sex, not gender, because sex is objective and totally separate from culture. They say sex is what really determines the struggles we face, that sex is inherently more in touch with material reality. But that doesn't gel with the simpler definitions they've latched onto lately. The thing about gametes and chromosomes is they're invisible, microscopic. If someone walks by you on the street, they don't know what your chromosomes are. Even a doctor can't say for sure without running tests. How could chromosomes be so essential to the oppression of women when most of us don't even know for sure what our own are? Well, chromosomes are important for sex determination because they tell your body what to do as it matures, what happens in the womb, during your puberty, and so on. They're instructions. And when you medically transition, you're kind of deciding to flout those instructions and follow your own instead. And I love that for you, so fish. Now this may surprise you, but I'm not a scientist. I am some lady who read a few books and set up a camera in her bedroom. But having maxed out my levels in gender and sex IRL, seeing this shit in 6 dimensions and solving gender in my head like it's timetables, I feel like I should still put this out there. When we're talking about sex in a social context, I don't see why chromosomes should matter more than the way our bodies actually are in the world. What they look like, how they function, how it feels to be in them. Because if we're talking about biological sex as a way to cut through the bullshit and talk material reality, DNA is kind of a distraction. People don't exempt me from misogyny based on information they don't have access to. TERFs use biological sex to lay claim to some special relationship to material reality, some impartial observer position where they just tell it like it is. But their prescription of trans people's bodies as male or female has nothing to do with how we live, how we treat each other, or how we interact with institutions. Hell, it barely has anything to do with bodies at all. Case in point, gametes, a widely used yardstick for sex in science. If a trans woman is on hormones long enough, she stops producing them. Hold up, okay, that's not quite right. This is true for some people, but it doesn't always happen. Hormone therapy is not a reliable contraceptive. Anyway, if she gets bottom surgery, her body can never produce them again. If TERFs used gametes as their definition of biological sex and stuck with it, that would mean that post-op trans women are no longer male. But, and this will surprise nobody, they don't. Instead, they opt to call us eunuchs, sterilized males. And I'm just like, where do you see that? On what grounds? According to transphobes, the most important thing about your body is defined not by what your body looks like, but by how it might have looked when you were born. Or not by what your body looks like, but by reproductive cells you may have no intention of using, cells you might not even have anymore. So what's up with this? How can TERFs claim this special connection to material reality while denying the realities of trans people's bodies? Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. Transphobes' definition of biological sex has nothing to do with biology. In fact, it has nothing to do with anything observable at all. They don't really believe that sex is your chromosomes or your gametes. They don't believe that sex is your legal marker or your hormones or your body type. What they believe, the only thing they believe, is that sex is how you're born and it can never change. It's that simple. And they used to be upfront about this. Trans-exclusionary feminism branded itself as being for women-born women until like a decade or two ago. It was exclusion for exclusion's sake. They only shifted gears recently when their unabashed prejudice came under fire. But modern radical feminism is still like that. The only thing that's changed is they fortified their prejudice with scientific jargon to make it look reasonable. And this is why their definition of sex is so slippery. It's hard to define sex in a single way that is both true and categorically invalidates trans people. Because in most ways that count, trans women are female and trans men are male. At least we can be. But TERFism can't survive a conclusion like this, because the whole purpose of defining sex is excluding us, deciding who doesn't get resources or community, deciding who isn't female more than deciding who is. If trans people fit into their theory of sex in any way, the theory doesn't work anymore, so it has to change. And here's the truly galaxy-brained shit, the take I've spent the last 40 minutes priming you for. TERFs don't believe in biological sex. They believe in the inescapable power of birth assignment, powerful enough that its impact endures even when no trace of it remains. They believe that birth assignment dictates whether you are a pure person who's destined to be victimized or a threat who's not to be trusted. They believe that your assigned sex at birth should determine what you can do, what you can call yourself, and who you can associate with. This belief is a rigidly idealist one, and it doesn't hold up to real-world scrutiny. But it's the core of their whole movement. It needs to be true, or everything else falls apart. The thing about treating sex as the most important thing and imparting deep cultural meaning onto people's bodies is you've just invented gender again. That is literally where gender came from at the very beginning. That's what gender was 2,000 years ago, and it's what gender was in the 1920s. I thought these people were supposed to be gender critical. It seems like they want us to step back several decades into the past when gender did exist, but we had no language to talk about it. We named gender in the first place to talk about how gender roles are artificial, how women's place in society is not natural. And I think this has worked. Nowadays, calling gender a social construct is so tame it barely feels worth saying. But TERFs want us to stop using this language. They identify themselves as the most principled, strident, radical feminists. But to borrow a page from their playbook, I don't give a shit how you identify, I care what you are. And the vast majority of TERFs are, at this point, fighting to control the bodies of women and people they think are women. They're fighting to reinstate the old order, where men and women inhabit separate worlds that can never touch, where gender is ignored and so-called natural sex differences justify all kinds of discrimination. Setting aside whatever ideals they claim, this is the world they're trying to build. This is what happens if they win. You want to talk material reality? There you go. Whew. Oh boy. Hey, so on a lighter note, we're coming up on a year of the channel now. It's funny to say that because I actually started this channel about 6 years ago. I have been trying at this on and off since 2012, and I never expected it to work in the way it has been. In the past year, I've been trying really hard to make this sustainable and to make this community a healthy one. That's why I'm really excited to announce that my videos are now available on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming platform owned by its creators. There are a lot of upsides to this. Creators on Nebula aren't bound to the algorithm, so we can explore the topics we care about. We can talk about sensitive topics like this one without fear of getting demonetized. Nebula doesn't even have ads, even the one you're watching right now. And there is so much good stuff on there. Nebula has Lindsay Ellis, FD Signifier, H Bomber Guy, Cat Black. I could go on. And it gets better. If you follow my link in the description, you can get Nebula for free right now because there's a bundle deal with CuriosityStream. If you don't already know, CuriosityStream is an educational streaming service with thousands of documentaries on all sorts of topics, from food to psychology to wildlife. If you like learning about badass women throughout history, and who doesn't, you might enjoy Calculating Ada, the Countess of Computing. It's about Ada Lovelace, the visionary who wrote the first computer program all the way back in 1843. If that sounds like your kind of thing, you can use my link and get a discount on an annual subscription. If you sign up before December 25th, you'll get a staggering 42% off. A whole year of CuriosityStream and Nebula for less than $12. It's a ridiculously good deal. To sign up for CuriosityStream and get Nebula for $0 extra, head to curiositystream.com/LilyAlexander. Thanks again to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this video. And for that matter, thanks to all of you for your support over the past year. I can't tell you how much it's meant. I can never manage to do the credits in one go. I also wanted to thank Laura Crone and Sarah Feldman for lending their voices to this video. They both have excellent YouTube channels, so definitely check them out. I'm looking back at where I was a year ago, and it is absolutely wild how much has changed. I couldn't do that without all of you, and especially my supporters on Patreon. So as always, a huge thanks to my top patrons, including the numeral 1, Duck Rose Chilies, Pascal, Izzy, Maddie Mamode, Lillian Butler, Rebecca Gale, Sasha Karbaczynski, Caitlin, Hannah Leishnitz, Dan Lizotte, Rika Coy, Scott, sometimes Lucy, Margot Boivin, Jean, Cherie Monjovi, Ruby Landau Pincus, Detective Meow Meow, Autogyne Amelia. There's always one that's just like the best username you've ever heard. Alejandro Hernandez, Jen Pseudonym, Vivi, Ren, June, Fox Auslander, Mary Wishart, The Recognition Scene, Jane Malcolm, Darla Butler, Sammy Cohen, X-Ban Barris, Winona Honey, Henry Rachutin, Christopher Stilson, Celeste Blossom, Linda Jewers, Mariah, Teresa Tutt, Smaz V, Taylor Hardy, Kieran McMullen, Clara Griffin, Emily Martins, Sam Braley, Kiki, Lee Sloth Pope, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Kana Q, Lillian Revel, Jasperry Wartanen, Matilde, Delia the Snake, Luna Jade, Kate Chappell, Hot Girls Read Lennon, Erica Peterson, Guillaume, Jesse Kempkis, Madeline Mausoleum, Quillworth, Tracy Sim, Ari Runan and Tell, Charlie H, Megahertz, Ivy, Chloe Jane, Mel Cat, Gwen Loffman, Rosedale, Scatterflower, Mid-Tier Art, Wimble, Imogen Campbell, and that's actually the last one. Thank you all so much for making this possible and for making 2021 a shockingly good year for me. I'll see you in the next one.